So this is an absolute all-star panel with leaders who've worked on literally some of the largest titles across, genres, geographies, platforms, you name it. And the purpose really of this fireside is to pull the curtain back on some of those strategies, technologies, and insights that you can use that are available to all of the different teams out there to really understand what are you guys doing in your day-to-day to help the studios and the teams that you work with really gain a competitive advantage to go from that blueprint, that concept of a new game to, ideally that blockbuster scenario and what those stages in between are. So inspired by our State of the Player report, that revealed some of those psychological shifts that we've seen in audiences and players over the last 2 years. We want to be discussing some of those emerging trends, current challenges that devs have, identify opportunities for studios to meet those rising expectations of players today. So everyone that's tuning in, thank you for joining us. My name is Bastian Bergman. I'm one of the two co-founders and COO of Solston. And without further ado, let's jump straight in. So I'll prompt this with a question that I actually heard. This was our last October from Raf Koster, which probably a lot of you guys are very familiar with, and a lot of people listening to this are going to be very familiar with. And he was asked, well, what's really hard about launching games right now? And he said something really interesting where he said it's never been harder, and it's also never been easier to build and ship a game. So maybe we'll start with you, Scott, if you're okay with that. I don't mean to put you on the
Yeah,
spot, but
all good.
what's your take on that statement, and what's your take on just the state of gaming, the industry, and launching new experiences in general? Like, what do you see out there?
Yeah, when I hear that statement, I think to myself, gosh, that's it hits home so hard for me because it's so absolutely true, at least for me in my world. And I just experienced firsthand with Immortals of Avium a very challenging new IP that was built over the course of 5 years during the process of a studio being simultaneously built at that same time using a brand new engine, Unreal 5, which wasn't even fully finished when the team first
Mm-hmm.
started using it. They adopted it, in its preview stage before it was even beta and began hacking away at it and almost working in kind of hand in hand with the Unreal folks over at Epic to help shape the engine as they worked through it. And that game shipped on Unreal 5.1. And I think, we had some people speak at the keynote for Unreal Fest last year. And in that keynote, we spoke our truth, which is Unreal 5 single-handedly made that experience better and easier and faster and more efficient for our smaller, kind of modest sized AAA team to build a big budget AAA game, like a high production value AAA game, but at like a fraction of the cost of what we're hearing it takes for big first party studio titles to get made at the AAA level. It was still a lot of money, the game, don't get me wrong. And I think it shows out in the production value, but there's no way a team of 100 people gets that game done without an engine that was, built to help us make it.
Mm-hmm.
Just cut corners and do things that, were hard to do. So awesome, right? Like that's made it a lot easier. And for those that are coming out of school or that are, converting from Unity, like learning that engine, I think is going to help them also, feel the effects of that. And then I think about the UGC platforms that are out there now that are emerging, right? With UEFN being a big one, but Roblox and Minecraft have been around even longer. Like that's lowering the barrier to entry, right?
Mm-hmm.
For people looking to get into games and for young folks. And that's super exciting to me. And I've been massively studying that sort of as a student of the industry. I've been in it for over 15 years, starting as a journalist, game journalist, reviewing games for GamePro. Like that's wild to me that one or two people with a passion, and they could be students in university
Mm-hmm.
or high school students, are able to make games now with these UGC platforms. So all of that lowers the barrier to entry, and that answers into the statement of it's easy. It's never been easier to build a game.
Yeah.
It's also never been more difficult to ship a game. I feel like, especially if you're trying to do it at the AAA PC console level, because now what we're seeing is this influx of content. There's so many people making so many things,
Mm-hmm.
so many different games, from one person indie projects all the way up to new AAA studios like Ascendant, and you read about it in the news all the time. Former developers from XYZ studio have broken off to form their new a new
Mm-hmm.
studio. Well, all of those games end up on storefronts like Steam, And yes, we read about how gaming is getting bigger as a hobby and more people are becoming gamers around the world. But there's still 24 hours in a day. So you're hearing terms like attention economy come up because it's like you're competing for everything. You're competing for people got to go to school, they still got to go to work, they do after school activities, maybe they play sports or they do music or theater or whatever, and then when they come home and they do entertainment, what else do you have at your disposals? Your mind immediately goes to long form streaming services like Netflix, but it's also all the short form content and YouTube content and individual influencer made content. And so discoverability and just breaking through the noise, especially I feel like coming from the PC and console space, is my single greatest challenge as a marketer, and I think has become the single greatest challenge of game development in general. It's like it's not just good enough. I hear this all the time. I heard it at GDC. If you just build a really great game, people will show up, and it's like I just went through a process where we built a really great game, and not enough people showed up, right? And so that's a challenge. It's a massive challenge.
I want to hand you the mic, Reg, because I know there's a lot of notes that Scott just shared, a lot of different sound bites that I know you and I have talked at length about in the past. Hearing that, how do player insights in general help with some of those challenges?
It's interesting that you say that. So if there were 12,000 games released on Steam in 2024, in 2004, it was 72, I believe. So that's who you're competing with. You're on the PC side. On the mobile side, there's currently over 1 million active games on the App Store. So just looking at those two numbers, and then also understanding that only 9% of folks' attention span is actually available for you to grab. They're on Heyday, they're on Candy Crush, they're on all of these games that have existed since the mobile platforms actually came to fruition. So that's actually what you're competing with. If you have to look at, okay, how do player insights help with these industry-wide challenges? It tells you where there's an underserved market that you can actually go after. It tells you what is this need that I need to fill. They're getting bored, so you have to actually fill that itch. And that's how you can actually take them away from the incumbents. That's actually how you can say, okay, this person's been playing this pattern for 10 years. We need to do a fresh spin on this pattern. And then we need to make sure that we're reaching that audience where they are today, not where they were 10 years ago. Just because somebody was on Facebook 10 years ago and an ad reached them then, that's not exactly where you're going to find them now. Now they've got kids. Now they've got, now they're jet setting around the world. If they don't have kids, they've got all of these different things competing for their attention, and you have to meet them where they are. So what you really want to do is understand their motivations, understand why they're playing, and then cater your game to that specific need that they're trying to fill. So
Nick, no, this is awesome. And I think this is a great segue to, maybe Nick, for you to share some of your thoughts, with almost, the 10 years of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and some of the new games, like those are iconic franchises, and they've especially Star Wars has been around for, that title has longevity to it. So I'd be curious to, build on one of the things that Reg just said and maybe, extend a little bit into what have you seen? How have audiences evolved over the last few years in terms of preferences, their expectations? Like, what are people looking for out of games compared to like maybe 5 or 10 years ago to where people are at now? And, what are maybe some of the hypotheses of where do we think things are going because I think Reg made a really important point. We have to meet people where they are. And ideally, if we're building a game now that takes a couple of years to build, ideally we can anticipate where people will be going and where they will be at by the time we launch a new game in a couple of years. So curious.
There's a bunch to unpack. I actually just want to like briefly touch and say, like, I love everything that's been said about sort of the difficulties and the easiness of it. I would also say is that, like, once you unblock one set of problems, there is a new set that always like rushes in. I would say like the new set, and I think Scott said it, it's that it is easy to make a game, but it is difficult, I think, at this point to validate whether your game has purchased in like the broader world. Not even if you've again, plenty of great games get made, not even discoverability, but it means like, and it just may not resonate. So people can make great stuff, but then also like, is there an audience worth finding? I think what has filled that void is sort of the testing side, which then I guess like sort of segues into it. It's not just testing like, playtest, it's testing of audiences and what have you as well. And so, I remember we were working with a CI firm when I was first working on Galaxy of Heroes. And they made an interesting observation at the time. And I was very new in my career. And so I was like, whatever, this is just a provocative thing to say. But they sort of made a thing, and it sounds negative, but it's not. But they were like, you've lowered the barrier of what is core, is like what they basically said. And so, like, even to that point, like something like Galaxy of Heroes, it helped. And I'm not going to say solely did it, but it's a part of like we're shifting from Eastern RPGs more into like what we would think of these like Western character role-playing games, and then that would become mid-core. And even then, I remember at the time, one of the things that we in Galaxy, one of the things we strove for is humane monetization, and monetization that fit sort of the broader Western audience's appeal. And I remember people saying like, you're getting rid of gotchification, you're giving away characters for free. You can never do that. And we were like, actually, we think we can, because like evidence we're seeing in the market, testing we're doing inside of the game is showing how that's shifting as well. And it was a bet, and I think we were right. And we've seen a number of other people begin to move in that direction as well. In fact, I would say there's the great divide in both gameplay and monetization in West and Eastern games, right? And so that takes us now even further ahead. And I happened to have had a boys' weekend this last weekend, and I was hanging out with a friend, and he's not in the industry, and he had sort of a profound, like very simple observation. I was saying, what it feels like has happened is that in the West, we've moved more and more of the randomness. We continue to push randomness into the game and out of the monetization layer, and more it becomes increasingly deterministic in sort of Eastern games, but very, very gotchified. And he goes, oh, it's I don't remember what his counter, but he's like, basically it goes from a casino like arm pull versus something else. And he wasn't being dismissive. He's not saying anything bad about games. I don't think that that's necessarily an indication of like how games are good or bad. It's just to say that Western proclivities have changed pretty dramatically. And so even in a 10-year arc, we went from people having what were the equivalent of like JRPGs on games to something like AFK Journey, which is beautiful and revelatory in many of its own ways. But just from those two endpoints alone, it's very different. So in summary, like tying the bow on, audiences are changing quickly. Taste cycles are probably sub 2 years at this point. So, and dev is 4 to 5. So if you're going to make something, it's like you're kind of throwing like, I think this is. So we are now in the process of needing to develop frameworks of not only what is good now, will it continue to be good, and can we also anticipate the evolution of demographies themselves? Like I think again to Scott's point about people growing up and becoming these things as well. So it's increasingly trying to land, I think it was like parachute jumpers, trying to land on a little dot out in the field somewhere. You can do the big thing, you can get into the air, but finding it and landing it, it's increasingly difficult.
I'd say it's actually landing. Your metaphor is more like you're trying to land that dot on like a moving ship.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
You know what I mean?
At the risk of falling in the ocean.
Yeah. And I'd echo exactly what you just said from my marketing perspective. I've been saying a lot to folks I work with, that I feel like, when I started my career, you had a playbook and it worked pretty well. And you could replay some of the plays in your playbook on the next campaign and on the next campaign, regardless of game genre, and it would work. And now I feel like my mentality, my mantra going in with my teams on every new project is throw out your entire playbook, like start with no assumptions and start from scratch, because so much changes. And now that I have young kids, that are 5 and 8, I witness it every day in their consumption habits too. It's like whatever you thought worked when you shipped a game 3 years ago, like some of it might work still, but you shouldn't assume any of that and just start from scratch.
That's a great jump off. Sorry, go ahead, Reg.
Sorry, I always say focus on authenticity. Because they've gotten to the point where they can recognize the pattern. So if you are using a pattern from a playbook 3 years ago, they already know what it is. And if they enjoy that pattern, they're going to hop on it and be very excited. But if they don't, there's no way to kind of glide them into exploring your game to find something that they do enjoy now. So yeah, I really think, and when you said, okay, well, we've got a 5-year game ramp for this game, I do think we're going to start seeing shorter game cycles. And I do think we're going to start seeing updates more frequently, because people want to fail faster now, because they don't want to wait 5 years to fail with the game, to fail with the audience. Instead, what they want to do is get a chunk of it out and then say, okay, can I grow with my audience? And what I'll tell you from my experience, if you are operating from that at launch and going, okay, I need to grow with my audience, you're already behind. So if you go in and you say, okay, we're going to grow with our audience, and we're going to get something out there very, very quickly, and then we're going to modify it and see how it grows with the taste of our audience, you're actually going to have a more authentic landing than if you say, okay, we're just going to go out and buy $60 players on Facebook or on any of the app stores or via any other service. And that's kind of thing. I believe that's where we're heading. And that's actually one of my mantras. I want every indie to be successful, but in order to do that, you really have to help them understand how big their audience is going to be. How big could this niche audience be for you? You're saying it's 35-year-old men, but it's only resonating with 45-year-old women. Cool. Now that you know that, and you know they're willing to spend X amount of dollars on your game per year or that genre per year, you can now build a team around that and build updates around that so that it's actually a profitable and really good experience. But we didn't have that information 5 years ago. We didn't have that ability to kind of readjust. And we also didn't have the pressure of like, okay, you really only get one shot on goal. We had like 6 shots on goal and could keep going. So now it becomes more important for us to actually get after that kind of stuff. And I do think, and I love the fact that we're going to see so many indies coming out in November and everybody competing against each other. And absolutely, we're going to see like a breaking apart of the audience. And we're going to see smaller games taking a bigger piece of that pie. But a lot of them, which means no more blockbusters.
I think you guys are hitting on really, really important notes that where from here, I think what would be really useful for the audience, I can imagine, is because all of you guys have worked on so many really cool games that had really unique, specific challenges, taking that and like learning from this, your guys' individual experience here. And I think, Scott, you said it going in when you referenced the unique challenges around Immortals of Avium. And if you don't mind me throwing a question at you there, when you compare when you guys made that game, that decision was made, like the jump off point there, compared to how you're making games. And you said, some of the things around, I tell my teams, like, throw the playbook out and you start from scratch every single time. Like, what has changed about your guys' approach, and what insights do you now look for when you're embarking on the journey of we're making something new that maybe you previously weren't looking for, or that you didn't have access to, or you just weren't aware that was going to be really helpful throughout that process? So anything you can share there?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember with Immortals of Avium is that, that game started as a single person's idea, right? And it quickly became a passion project for Ascendant as a studio and for a large group of people. But the idea, the genesis for Immortals started with the CEO and the founder and the game director, and the studio was really formed specifically to build that game. And so, as naturally the ideas kind of evolved and got shaped over time with lots of people. It didn't, the end product wasn't the result of a single person. But it was very much like this game was designed and built for players who grew up loving single player story driven shooters. And I think largely the game delivered on that, and delivered for people that like those kinds of experiences. When I look at the average user scores across the major storefronts, they're hovering in the 80s, which is a pretty good sign. And that game also, like, it went underwent a lot of kind of like classical user testing as we were in the finishing stages for the game. So we did all the things that typical game dev process would do to help us fine tune the game design, balance the game, address issues that were, causing people to drop out at certain points, all of that. So, but I think my point is the game's concept was not informed at all by any research prior to that. Right. And I look at this And I say, you know, well, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's so many, I feel like I can point to so many games I've worked on in my career and brought to market that start exactly from that place. You know, like I've been fortunate enough to work on, you know, the BioShock franchise. I helped ship BioShock Infinite. I worked on Borderlands 2 and 3 and pre-sequel and everything in between. Like some of the most successful games I've had a good fortune to being part of. I don't think they started from a place of like research backed audience profiling where they're like, aha, I know now there's a need over here. There's a real strong desire for this type of game concept. So now I'm going to think about what I could do to answer that problem. Like it was just, you know, it's people being creative and pursuing their passion and making great, you know, a great game and then holding their breath, hoping that an audience is going to show up. And I've been on both sides of that. I've been on the side where it's a massive hit and turns into multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar franchises, you know, and then I've been on the other side where you get across the finish line and the game reviews great and doesn't sell. You know, well, I can think of Evolve, I can think of Battleborn, I can think of a lot of games that I've worked on in my past. So the studios process is evolving now. Like I think we're moving forward into the future where it's going to become more insights driven. And I think, you know, Reg had mentioned it. It's I think it's essential that not only game devs, but also their publishing and marketing comrades also look at this through the lens of this is a very saturated market. There's a lot of products coming in from a lot of creative people all over the world, different walks of life, different lived experiences. Like it's amazing. It's the best time ever to be a gamer because there's something out there for you if you're willing to look for it. But at the same time, if you're doing this for a living and making games, you need to know going in, or I think you would want to know going in, that there's going to be an audience waiting for you on the end of whatever it is, even if it's a 2-year development cycle. That's 2 years of your life. Think about how much goes by in 2 years, let alone 5 or more, you know? So you want to know that there's an audience at the end waiting for you. And so I feel like that's where Ascendant as a studio, you know, and myself and our founders and C-suite, you know, we're looking to seek to understand our audience on a human behavioral level, you know, at the paper concept phase when we can fail fast, when it's cheap, development costs are really low. With those insights, we can not only know if there's a large enough audience there that supports the business model that we're thinking of, we could adjust the business model if we need to, if we find out like, oh, that's, you know, good idea, but wrong business model. Or, you know, if it all lines up and it's like, oh, our intuition was right. And there is an audience waiting for us. Well, then we can start to make those more nuanced, important design decisions, you know, about, oh, this needs to go this way because it'll be stickier, you know, it'll resonate, it'll retain more. That's, you know, I don't know. I'm one of those people that operates. I'd rather have a lot more intel on my side going into the project than less. And then just like holding your breath and hoping for the best.
When you think back to your Fall Guys days, Reg, where, you know, premium, mobile, free to play, that whole transition, and I think what, you know, Scott just said a really interesting thing, and maybe that's where we can also color in some of the differences between, you know, what are we seeing on the PC side, what are we seeing on the mobile side, and how do we reconcile like premium, free to play, all those differences. But when you think back to that project, that transition, what did you rely on? And looking back, like what do you wish you have had at the point? And what type of insights that you had access to that you were using did you find most valuable to make that launch and the transition the success that it was?
We were lucky that we launched during the PlayStation free month, because that gave us insight into how big this audience could be, but it also gave us insight into how much they're willing to spend on a premium game. Because of how much demand there was there, that gave us an indication that we should be going free to play. When you're going free to play and you know that you have that much demand, you have a bunch of different parameters you have to figure out first. And that was when we were at Mediatonic. We hadn't yet been acquired by Epic, so you have to think about, can we support all those free-to-play players? Can we make content for all of those free-to-play players? How fast are they going to burn through that content? But the key that we found out when we went from premium to free-to-play was, what type of content were we going to have to build out for them? What did our season passes now have to look like? Did we even need a season pass? Because in premium, yes, we had a pass, but we also had a different way of charging for that now. premium folks wanted pay once. That was their mindset. That was their psychology. That's how they thought about, you know, this is my game. I'm going to play it forever. Versus, or I'm going to then buy the expansion pack. Versus free to play players, which is you have to get them in there. You have to engage them. You have to make that it's sticky. You have to make sure that their friends are playing. You have to make sure that they're talking about your game. You have to make sure that they are staying around long enough and feel the itch enough in order to want to buy that season pass, in order to stay around, because it's so easy to say, okay, I'm just going to not play this game anymore. It didn't cost me any money. So when we were thinking about that, we had to look at who our players were going to be. And one of the things we did was we looked at Solston and said, how big is our market? And then how many different profiles that we have in there. And we had a lot of profiles in there, and they were very splintered. And it was very interesting trying to figure out which of those profiles we were actually going to build for. And that's one of the things that our creative director was actually looking at, and it made his life really easy to say, okay, listen, this is my gut, but this is backing up my gut. This is what is saying is out there. This is what our audience is likely going to look like when we go free to play. We also had the amazing insights that we got from the Fortnite and Epic team. So we had we now had like a full research team backing us up on top of everything else. So there does also come a point where there's too much information and you can hit a paralysis point. So it's just understanding like, okay, this is the biggest audience. This is what they care about. Let's get that information and go test it. And then I would say that the best part of that was watching the Bobs, which is our board of beans, which I jokingly talk about with everyone, literally resonate what we were seeing in the profiles. And what they were complaining about and what they were enjoying were matching to the profiles, which was really nice.
So were you able to effectively link the Bobs back to some of the, Scott used the word like human level insights, like the psychology of it and how you were looking at the players, you guys were able to connect those two dots?
I would say yes. What I will tell you is we are very serious about not profiling players. So we had an understanding of the audience and who they could be. And because of how big our board of beans were, we knew that we had those audiences inside of our pool. And we were running right up to the day we launched, 10,000 an hour. We were adding in new Bobs into the game and getting the same feedback so that we knew it was at least consistent at that point. So
you said something really interesting that, I want to make sure that we're shining a light on for everyone, because I think that's a really, really important point. You gave the example of your creative director and backing up, validating but backing up that gut feel, the creative notion. And I think, Scott, that's where you're going with some of the things where a lot of the games, it is a creative endeavor after all. And I remember Raph saying this too, like, this is a man that built Ultima Online and EverQuest, like, talk about games, 20, 30 years ago, and you start with an idea, right? That he's like kind of the example of, what it means to be a creative mind. And he would even say now, well, day one, I start with the business model because I have to, and I have to think about who I'm making this for. So this validation of the gut feel for the creative director, who were some of the other people that were involved in that process on your end, Reg, where you felt like they really benefited from having those insights, being able to just go, okay, I can sense check myself against something that is just more objective than my perception or my intuition, my gut feel, whatever label we want to give it.
So our entire game design team had access. It was the opportunity for them to go in there. We didn't hold back any information. We didn't say, look at this. We didn't go out and say, okay, here, we're going to put a deck together for you. And the reason why is we wanted them to go in there and find their own insights and to understand their players. Those are important aspects of any game that you're building. And when you're working on a game, it can be very hard for you to say, okay, my players feel this way, particularly when you're talking about an audience of 60 million players. You can say to yourself, okay, I think a portion of these players will enjoy this, but then how do you say, okay, I'm building for the right portion, or I've got the right cadence of content coming out, or I've got the right cadence or the right type of content coming out at the right moments. That's where you really put this in the hands of your game designers, put this in the hands of your creative directors, and then say, come ask me questions about what you're seeing, because I help you understand the data, but go in there and truly understand who these people are and why they're playing your game. And that's kind of where I would be. I bet you Nick's got a comment on that.
Y-
Because
I'm pretty sure.
yeah,
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, we spend I mean, there's a lot that could be said. I mean, it's such a tepid answer to it, but I would say, um, specifically, like when I think back to our experience with Galaxy of Heroes, when you think about Star Wars fans in general, there are many different expressions of what that looks like, and specifically like some people that deeply resonate from it from an emotional perspective
Mhm.
versus those that are considering it from like a competitive or a collective perspective, right? And so a lot of so not only was it a matter of like, figuring out your total addressable market, it also in many ways guided for us feature creation over time.
Mhm.
Because what we found is that many of those audiences weren't as transitory as like was sort of prevailingly thought at the time. And so, when you start, it's not just how do we land, it also then carries through what sort of features should we be building for these
Yeah.
folks, like what's going to keep people engaged for the long term. And so I think it's, to Scott's earlier note about having a pattern, I think it's very easy, and I'm not going to say lazy, but it goes, well, they made this thing, it worked, like we'll do it as well. And don't be wrong, it's probably a perfectly fine feature. It's probably a perfectly fine feature in your game, but it doesn't mean that the players want it. And so like, I think that a lot of trying to figure that out, and I would say currently I'm working deeply in incubation and new game development. And so again, I'll point back that not only are we looking at from sort of a business plan perspective, but also once we have them, to your point, Reg, about what does the content roadmap look like? How often do we think these folks are going to need to be engaged with? Some games are ravenous; they will demand everything constantly, and some want something that they have to chip away at over a long period of time. I would say even inside of the Solston personas, it's indulgence versus some of like the other like types of spin patterns. And again, not all of this is about spin, but like at the end of the day, games are businesses that are, I always refer to them as art projects that decide one day to make money. And so, and that means they're already on uneven footing as it is, because it desperately wants to be a creative endeavor, but also longs to be something that can create stability, not just for the people that work on it, but for the players. Again, to Reg's point earlier, games right now are predominantly like sort of seeded by the top 15 incumbents from the past years, right? People like that stability. They like those things because people do want to build a lifestyle around the things that give them inspiration, their creative endeavors, the way they express themselves in that way. And so it is incumbent on us to follow those threads all the way through, and it's constant. Never win that battle. I think if we had sat down and wrote out what Galaxy of Heroes is today versus what it started as, like, furthermore, it wouldn't work. You would never want to launch that game. It works because it's grown with the players. It's unobservably different than if we had said, "Hey guys, let's write a 20-year spec on like what a game could look like." You can't, nor should you do it, because you will miss the forest for the trees.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe to double down on that notion a little bit more. When can you color in your process a little bit? Because you brought up a really important point around it's not just launching new games, also greenlighting new features, and how do these projects evolve, and how do you make sure that what we're putting in a live game actually hits the mark? You mentioned using Solston data. There's other insights that you guys are using too. Can you color in and give some insights into your process of how do you guys evaluate new game concepts or new features? Even like any frameworks you can share with the audience for how do you build, launch, greenlight new games, new features, and where do you incorporate what types of insights along that process?
I would say that we're actually like kind of in the process of, I think we've had an effective process for a while, but I do think that the market has materially changed enough that we have to kind of deeply rethink it in many ways. And so right now, what me and the other folks are sort of thinking through is like, what does that mean? Because I think a lot of times, to Scott's point, like someone has a thing and they love it, and so then it's brought and it says we should make this thing, but then you have a number of additional disciplines go like, how do we market that? I don't know who my audience is, or like what is the tech stack that needs to exist? So, and I believe it was Reg saying, like getting in there and working on these things earlier. So look, right now, kind of the flow of what we're thinking about is we're looking for places of potential heat. We're not so foolish. Like you cannot analyze yourself into a $2 billion, $3 billion business. If you could, I wouldn't be here. I'd be doing that thing. like I would, that's where I would be. So it's a matter of First, set a foundation for what is a reasonable market hypothesis. And I know for probably any indie developers are like, eye roll, I don't want to do that. But like a reasonable market hypothesis could be like, you know, just finding, shooters are on decline. Okay, but we think that people still have those Twitch skills. What sort of Twitch experiences relative to potential
Mhm.
shooting experiences? Like that's at least a place. And to ask yourself, what are things that are potentially fun in that space? And again, I think to that point, it's about building that core quickly and putting it in front of players, even in very small, like
Mhm.
local playtest solutions, just even 10 folks. And that's not statistically valid, but it's at least directional. It's a way for you to say, are we about to spend 2 years, 3 years, 4 years building out this? And it turns out people always hated it, or like this was always off, or it needed something more. Because there is an element of being a great craftsman and you could make a great
Mhm.
experience, but it is like on its fundamentally flawed in its premise. And so what you want to do is very early start checking those premises early. And again,
Yeah.
because you just don't want to spend all your time and money like working on things that no one wants to play. And so that sounds like easy, like, hey, go get a research budget and like be incredibly thoughtful. And hey, indie game makers, 5 of you, none of you are statisticians or design of experiment specialists. Just get that stuff figured out. Like I know that sounds like, but what I would say is that I believe there's an emerging community of folks that think about games in these ways. There are a number of people. This is the great consolidation that we're going through
Mhm.
right now, but a number of folks have been shed in the industry. So there's people that have been exposed to that. Look to bring those folks into your team. Find people with an analytical chip on their shoulder is the way I describe it, like someone
Mhm.
that has like a point to prove by way of data. And again, it doesn't have to be large data sets or anything like that. It's about starting from a position of data that informs a leap of faith, and from that leap of faith begin to use the game as a vehicle that creates knowledge for you. And
Mhm.
as you create that knowledge, react to that knowledge. Do not be so bullheaded as to believe that you have all the answers. The auteur is not dead, but it's teams that build great games, and it's teams that are informed by great
Mhm.
insight from their players. And that is the thread that we have to fall through. It is a relationship. It is an evolution. It is a
Mhm.
symbiosis. Embrace that and love it and accept it.
I am high-fiving you over here. I am
Chef's kiss.
literally high-fiving
Chef's
you.
kiss.
This for anyone watching this recording, I think the last minute and a half, 2 minutes, you want to rewind, you want to listen to that again. You want to
Just drop
rewind,
the
you want to
mic.
listen to it again. It's thank you guys. So if I were to summarize that a little bit, and I'm not going to do this justice, Nick, like you were far more eloquent than I am.
Oh,
But
I'm caffeinated. That's all it is. Don't
that's
worry.
but it's you said basically the stages that you could use as a framework. And I love this idea of try and bring in some people that have an analytical chip on your shoulder that they're just wired that way. So within your team, you can marry that creative side, but be data informed to just validate hypotheses and assumptions. So start with data to inform a really good premise and a really good hypothesis. I love that notion of places of potential heat. Where could those be? Do you have data to back up that assumption? Build the most minimal thing that you can build as quickly as possible, get it in front of people, collect data as early, as quickly as possible before embarking on the journey of, are we going to spend 2, 3, 4, 5 years on this? Let alone, are we going to spend, tens of millions or, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars on making this? How soon in the process can we see success criteria or get confidence that this hypothesis that we have, the premise that we're using here, is one that is a really good foundation for potential success? And then evolve along the process where you're not locked into it has to be this thing that we thought it was a year ago. We're fine if there's variations and we're adapting to things that we're learning along the way. Am I doing you justice?
Yeah, I would say
Okay,
so. And
awesome.
it's like as a final note there, I would just even say, whenever I'm training up new like people that work in live production environments, I say, when you're in charge, it's about jazz, baby. Like you're the show runner. Like you're
Yeah,
not there to say where it goes. You make sure that everybody is served, but that we move with the music. You give
yeah,
everybody a chance to elevate, to have a moment, and one of those people is the audience.
yeah,
It's that in between space as well. And so
yeah.
like it's jazz. You just got to move with the flow. Let the music rule.
It's awesome. So sticking to the music analogy, the different instruments that we're playing, and maybe Reg will, if you're okay, we'll start with you. When you think of those different instruments, and now we're pivoting a little bit to the player insights, tech stack, tools, methods, because you guys have touched on, a lot of different types of data that you can get from different types of players. If you could build it ideally from scratch, this is the tech stack that you said this is a must-have for me in terms of insights into my player base. What's best practice from your vantage point that people out there should take a look at?
Well, I always say Solston, mostly because I want to know who my audience is first. What I want, what I want is I want everybody to have a Bob's, which goes absolutely back to what Nick just said in terms of making sure that you can test with your players. It's not necessarily good for you to go out and test with 5 friends and family, because those 5 friends and family are probably a little bit like you. They're definitely gamers, or they've heard you talk about games for the last 20 years of your life, and they're just like, I get it, and I know what these people want to hear. What I want is the next evolution of Solston. I want I want community by Solston. I want to be able to go in there and say, okay, my audience is this big, and now I'm going to test it with 1,000 of this type of player and get that feedback and be able to survey those folks, and then be able to track a resonance score after each build. Did it get better? Did it get worse? It's like you're at the eye doctor. This is good. This is bad. And then be able to look at the stats, because you also want to marry that. And it goes back to what Nick said about having someone with an analytical chip on their shoulder, because they'll tell you one thing because they want you to love them. But the other thing is we want to actually build for you, not just have, love for you. You have to marry it with what are they doing in your game. So you need to be able to look at how much time are they spending? Are they spending more or less this session time? Are they spending more time on this feature? Are they spending less time on this feature? Are they chatting in their game? Are they referring their friends in? Do they want to, if it's, by the way, if it's a solo player game, important, but not as important as if you are saying a battle royale, or are they using the same items over and over again? Are they exploring the new content that you're putting out there for you? Those are the kind of things you want to marry up. You want to marry up the psychological, their actual actions, and then you want to marry it up with the analytics and what that's telling you. And I think if you can get those 3 things together, you have a game. Whether your game is a blockbuster, you know how big that audience is, you know how much money you should be spending on them, the types of features that are resonating. So you're going to have a successful game, and then you can right size your team if you have to, or you can add more people and suddenly find you have a 300-person team. But when I think about it, it's a bit of analytics. It's definitely a lot of survey and understanding of the players. And it's about understanding where they are, understanding how they think and what they need. So I know you were like, oh, give me a database and give me Solston and give me, no, it's never that easy. And also you have to think about when big companies, you'll hear it again and again, like, I can't use that because my security team won't let me. It's too expensive. It doesn't fit in the budget. Pen and paper, get on the phone, talk to your player if you have to. There are many different ways to arrive at this information. So I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but I will say, reach out and I can cobble something together for any indie that would like more information.
I can vouch for that, and I will personally. Scott, when you hear that, like, what would you add to that? Like, what solutions do you typically rely on? And when you look at some of the exposure that you've had to Solston and our insights, for example, what's been different about looking into our platform, looking into the data that we're able to provide for some of the new games that we've been working on?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of your non-classical marketer in terms of my come up in the industry. I started as a games journalist, and I made my path through 2K largely in the communications department, as the communications director. And then when I moved into influencer marketing and kind of built the influencer marketing team at 2K, it was that was sort of a pivot point where data was so crucial to what we were doing. And at the time, all the company had to offer was a lot of affinity-based research. So I've worked with probably every affinity-based firm you can name out there. That's the big ones. And it wasn't, it was better than nothing, right? It was a starting point. But what we were always missing, and what I think we're now discovering and really loving at Ascendant with Solston is the sort of psychology-based kind of human element to this, like being able to understand who the individual is within a massive cohort, right? Your cohorts, if your audience profile is 140 million, you're like, cool, that's a huge number of people. There gotta be, every one of us is an individual, right? And so we're going to change, and we're going to vary our likes and our dislikes and our needs are going to change on an individual level. I think Solston has done a great job of helping us understand and try to cut through all of that and look at, okay, who is this individual and what do they want? What do they need? And so, just having that rooted in human behavior, and then, things like the traits, right? Being able to understand sort of just like top line ways, to understand who these people are that make up this larger group. But then most importantly, and I've had a great success using this recently, with our next game, as because our game has gone, this next game that we're working on has gone through a lot of iterations, from like one entire genre to an entirely different genre based on the data that we had collected. So it shows you what even an old guard, kind of very veteran, experienced AAA team, when they're open-minded to data and analysis and being able to pivot, what they can do, totally pivoted the game into a completely different space. And so, the lead game designer on it is looking in there every day at the motivators, what specifically motivating these players, so that he can design, more things to answer into that for those players, rather than the things that perhaps he would have more personally been interested in, right? Or the game director would have been interested in, or our biases based on our past history of just being lifelong gamers and what we find fun. It's like not always about what you think is fun, right? So those are that's like kind of, I would say for me, our story, Bastion, is I went out searching for an alternative option. I was like, is there, God, please tell me there's something out there that's different, that offers something a little bit more deeply rooted in player behavior, human behavior, rather than I like this, therefore I like this, therefore I like this, like the affinity research. The other tools I use, on the marketing side and have classically used for years and years to great success, just social listening is really important, but social listening tools come in a lot of shapes and sizes. And right now I haven't found one that I love anymore. My favorite ever was Spike Trap. If anybody ever worked on that, Spike Trap got acquired by Reddit. I worked very closely with the Spike Trap team. We were at 2K. We eventually became customers, but I laughed because Adam Sessler and group over there, Kieran, we were basically like the guinea pigs that they would come to our office, and we would, they would ask us, if you could have your best custom designed, social listening tool, what would it be? I don't know of another tool like that, but if someone wants to make one, it'd be great, because a good social listening tool doesn't ask you to input keywords and hashtags. It goes out and actually finds that and tells you what it thinks is relevant. And then through machine learning, it was just the best at understanding player sentiment and being able to really accurately grade player sentiment. Again, there's not much out there that does that, but I feel like, or does it particularly well. So that type of tool is something that I would love to see Solston or another group move into that space and fill the void that was left when Spike Trap was acquired. Because that's the kind of real time.
Absolutely.
What's going on out there at a mass scale? What are people saying? Why are they saying it? And then, if you're a savvy game dev, you can look through that and say, okay, this is how we should then be answering with feature set changes.
Yep. Which we'll talk about that. We actually have a social listening solution built into our platform for games that are live. So we can definitely shed some light there, but you nailed it. Like the Spike Trap solution, it's it's good for them with Reddit, but I know a lot of people really loved it. It was a really
good for
tool.
Reddit, bad for the rest of us.
Yeah, good for Reddit, bad for the rest of us. Exactly. Nick, closing thoughts from your side. When you think of the unique challenges around launching new games, or things that we've worked on over the last, few years here and there, how has working with Solston impacted how you think about launching new games, or, the go-to-market strategies of how you look at opportunities that you're evaluating for EA and mobile?
Yeah, and I would say that, what's interesting about my is like the context of being in a very large publicly traded company. So like, a lot of times what you're trying to do is navigate the equivalent of like internal venture capital, right? Like that's kind of what you're trying to do. And so I think Scott said it earlier, but like, it's a blue ocean. There's a million ideas, people are going for it. But I'll come back to that notion of heat, and that it's at least grounded. You can make a perspective, and so when you arrive to it, I love being a car salesman, because oftentimes like doing any sort of like game advocacy work is about like, hey, let me sell you that Toyota over there. But all joking aside, it's also the thing that can obscure great games getting made or greenlighting bad games, right? And it's not to say that everybody is bad or like a bad actor in that way. And so what I like to do is that I've with my team that I work with, I say like it's the appropriate muzzle for a silver-tongued producer like myself. And so like it's a way to make sure that what you're building is based in reality. And so a lot of what I really try to promote is like we have to not remove the human element, but let the creative element stand on its merits. Let it be as objective as possible. And when it comes then to trying to seek internal venture capital, like in a big company like EA, that I find is a very compelling argument. It's still, don't get me wrong, the other way still works, and the other way still gets great games work. But the way I want to work is to make sure that it's bound in something that is based in reality, that there is heat around it, so that we can use that to guide to create the box by which we decide to build the better machine. And so having the constraints helps prevent insane blue sky, which can cut down on the amount of development time. And it also means you've got a clear path to that first round of testing that we were talking about as well. So in your current role and what I'm working on, that's how I'm using it. And that's how I'm kind of thinking about it.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. This was wonderful. There's a lot of insights, a lot of knowledge and wisdom that you guys were able to share over last almost an hour. We're coming up on an hour here. I'm going to try and summarize the headlines for everyone that listened to this, and then you guys can tell me if I missed any blatant, obvious ones. But we're in an industry now where attention on the player side, user side, is extremely scarce. Competition's really fierce. Storefronts are crowded, platforms are crowded. It's really hard to stand out. Taste trends, preferences on the player's end have probably a shelf life of less than 2 years at this point. And if we really even want to stand a chance of building something new that can actually be a viable game, Blockbuster is the aspiration, but a viable business in its own right, even for a small team. We have to understand where players are or where they're going. We have to meet them on that journey and really build with them. So I think a lot of the playbooks that you guys have referenced, and you've said this, in different words, of what we've been using over the last 3, 4, 5 years, a lot of this we need to throw out the window and rethink how we're making games and how we're greenlighting games and how we're greenlighting features too. I don't want to limit it to that one side of it. And I think you start from a place of potential. You try and ground the premise in as much data as you can, build, iterate with even a small set of users as quickly as possible to, and I love the sentence, Nikki, use it in your closing statement there, to make sure that what you're building is based in reality and that creative thought has merit because it is based in reality. That last piece,
good.
Hang it in the Louvre. I love it.
Yes.
It's awesome.
Agreed.
So hopefully that I just did our conversation justice. Thank you guys for spending some time with us. This was phenomenal. For anyone out there listening to this, if you want to connect with any of these 3 individuals, let us know. We're happy to facilitate that. If you want to learn more about how player insights, psychological insights can feed into your analytics stack around players to support your development and how Solston can fit into that, we'd be more than happy to take the time to have a conversation to see where you're at and how we can be helpful.
We hope you enjoyed that video. For more tips and insights on how to build incredible user experiences and to turn your customers into fans, please like and subscribe or follow us on LinkedIn. You can find the links in the comments below. Thanks and have a great day.